Good morning, everyone. We will present Gideon Toury's translation theory, and our team is composed by Adriana Camarena, Sara Inés Lopez, and myself, Iberica Ramirez.
All right, so first we will see a little bit of background on translation as a discipline. Translation evolved into a discipline in the second half of the 20th century. Before that, according to Hebrew Sign 2006, the traditional approach to translation were all perspective, source-oriented, and synchronic. And by source-oriented, I mean that the translation aims at reproducing structures of the target language. However, all of this changed with Gideon Toury's translation theory. Now, who was Gideon Toury? Gideon Toury was an Israeli translation scholar and professor of comparative literature and translation studies at Tel Aviv University in 1970 and completed a PhD in literary theory entitled Translational Norms and Literary Translation into Hebrew, a book that became one of his major works. In 1880, he won the Hans Christian Andersen Award for his translation into Hebrew of C.S. Lewis' The Voyage of the Dawned Reader. He also became the first chair professor in CETRA, the research program in translation studies, in 1989. And from 1970 to 1983, Toury worked with other linguists in the journal Literature and funded Target, International Journal of Translation Studies. Okay, now Toury's major pieces of work. Gideon Toury is considered head of the descriptive translation studies. The theories exposed are explained in 3 major books. The first one is Translational Norms and Literary Translation into Hebrew in 1970. The second one is In Search of a Theory of Translation from 1980. And the third one is Descriptive Translation Studies and Beyond from 1995. Okay, descriptive translation studies, also known as the Manipulation School or the Tel Aviv Leuven axis. Descriptive translation studies corresponds to a descriptive, empirical, interdisciplinary, target-oriented approach to the study of translation, focusing especially on its role in cultural history and describing the phenomena of translation and translating. This approach was first developed in the early 1970s, gained momentum in the 1980s, and boomed in the 1990s. This approach is relatively new. It's very recent in comparison with other theories. Okay, now what is a target-oriented approach? Toury states that the context framing a translation is that of the target culture, and as such, the target text must always be interpreted as a result of the constraints and influences of such a target context, or as a cause for the introduction of changes into the target system. As a consequence, attention is shifted from the comparison of source and target text to the study of relations between the target text and their context, the target culture. To make it more simple, a target-oriented translation aims at adapting the text to the structure and cultural context of the target language.
The branch of TePTIE encompasses 3 main kinds of research. The first one is product-oriented. This focuses on the description of individual translations, the comparative descriptions of several translations of the same source text, either in the same language or in different languages, and the description of a larger corpuses of translation. Then we have the function-oriented. This focuses on the context rather than the translated text. And the process-oriented. This one focuses on what is going on in the translator's mind while translating. Gideon Toury contributed quite a lot to the descriptive translation studies, as seen in his work Descriptive Translation Studies and Beyond from 1995. He defined DTS as the study of what translation does involve under various sets of circumstances, along with the reasons for that involvement. Toury also promoted these studies, stating that no empirical science can make a claim for completeness and relative autonomy unless it has a proper descriptive branch. Other Toury's important proposals for DTS are the definition of this approach as descriptive explanatory and interdisciplinary, the proposal of a three-stage methodology for descriptive studies, the formulation of translational norms as the epitome of a target-oriented approach, and the formulation of theoretical, possibly universal laws of translation behavior as a go beyond descriptive studies. Now we're going to see the three-stage methodology. First, you need to identify and describe text that the target culture considers to be translations. Then you compare source and target text by associating segments from each text, although the criteria to select these segments is still in dispute. And finally, you identify regularities and formulate generalizations about norms of translational equivalence, identifying implications for future translation. Toury defines these norms as a translation of general values or ideas shared by a community as to what is right and wrong, adequate and inadequate, into performance instructions appropriate for and applicable to particular situations. A translator learns to play according to these norms. The first norms are called initial norms, and they basically determine the norms that will be considered in translation, either the norms from the source culture, which will be considered as an adequate translation, or the norms from the target culture, which will be considered as an acceptable translation. Then we have the preliminary norms. These revolve around two main sets of considerations, which are often interconnected. Those regarding the existence and actual nature of a definite translation policy and those related to the directness of translation. By translation policy, we mean those factors that govern the choice of text types or even of individual text to be imported through translation into a particular culture, language, and a particular point in time. Considerations concerning directness of translation involve the threshold of tolerance for translating for languages other than the ultimate source language. And finally, we have the operational norms. These are involved in the act of the translation itself. We mean the decisions that are made during this action, what is more likely to remain invariant to this transformation and what will change.
So Torres, after describing the norms of translation, he identified the universal law of translation. Adopting the aims of science, DTS purports to describe translational phenomena in order to understand and explain them, and by identifying regularities, to generalize and formulate probabilistic laws of translational behavior relating all variables found relevant. Toury tentatively formulates two such laws. The first is the law of growing standardization. In translation, source text teams tend to be converted into target language repertoires, or in other words, the network of textual relations present in the source text tends to be transformed or ignored in translation, being substituted by habitual target repertoire options. This means that, for example, if we have a saying in Spanish, in Mexican Spanish, translators tend to translate the sentence in terms that is more accepted in the target language, that is better understood instead of making it a literal translation. Then we're talking about standardization. And second, the law of interference. In translation, phenomena pertaining to the makeup for the source text tend to be transferred into the target text. The transfer may be negative when the translation deviates from what is normal in the target system, or positive when it does. Um, this means that when a translator translates the sentence or term in a literal manner, we are talking about a negative translation. On the opposite, if he adapts the term or the sentence to the target language, we call it a positive translation. So here we're going to go through some of the contributions of Gideon Toury theories. And in words of Rosa, Toury's main legacy, the concept of norms as a particularly operative theoretical interface between translation and context, has opened up the possibility for the consideration of translation as a social activity, constrained by prestige and the power relation enforced both within specific target culture situations and within a network of intercultural relations. This has also made it possible to consider the cultural role played by individual translators and their social, ideological, and political intervention. In words of Ebru Sain, unlike traditional translation studies, Toury's approach is target-oriented regarding target readers, descriptive instead of prescriptive since it describes translations that are already existing text in target culture. It is also functional, as this approach believes that translations play a particular role in the target culture. Gideon Toury's theory helped to see translation as an object of scientific study and as a discipline through his approach from a descriptive perspective, recognizing processes, functions, and products specific to a target culture. Also, the notion of translation norms, which are a description of patterns observed in translated text. And his theory doesn't come without criticism. Uh, in the words of Niranjana, because of it's not concentrated enough on the relevance of power relations and ideology for the consideration of intercultural and interlingual relations in empirical studies of translational phenomena. Another criticism is for not focusing enough on the translator as an agent operating in a specific set of circumstances, or for not considering further explanations for translational behavior due to its being too strictly target-oriented. And last, the primary task of the study of translation is not to seek to interfere directly with the practice of translation by laying down norms or rules. And as a conclusion, Gideon Toury's contribution to translation is undeniable. First, thanks to his work, translation acquired a discipline status in where norms and procedures exist, giving the translator a clear view in regards of the approach to carry on with his role as bridge between two cultures. Also, thanks to his descriptive studies, we're able to appreciate the mental processes that happen within the transformative act of translation. Without any doubt, more research has to be carried out in order to fully understand this process.